Sir Thomas More is a legendary figure in English history, brilliant lawyer, witty author and loyal statesman. He rose to become one of King Henry VIII's most trusted advisors and the Lord Chancellor of England. But their relationship was a very complicated one. More was a devout Catholic and a man of profound conscience, and Henry was busy breaking with the Church of Rome altogether. So how did such a close relationship end in betrayal, arrest, and one of the most horrible executions in English history? Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Today we'll explore the horrible execution of Thomas More. Part 2 of our series on the most horrible executions in history. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an upload. Thomas More's execution was horrible in many ways. It was carried out by one of history's most infamous and ruthless monarchs, a king who delighted in punishing those who opposed him. It was a punishment that destroyed his family and left his daughter mentally unstable. And it was carried out in one of the most public and brutal ways imaginable. The execution method that no one should ever have to endure, beheading. But why exactly did Henry decide to execute More? What did Thomas do to deserve such a fate? Well, the story goes back to the early 1530s. Henry was desperate to end his marriage to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, a marriage that had failed to produce a male heir and had left the king vulnerable in terms of succession. He wanted a divorce, but the Pope refused to grant it, mainly because Catherine was the aunt of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, and the Pope didn't want to upset the balance of power in Europe. So Henry decided to just go ahead and do it anyway. He broke with the Church of Rome, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and married Anne Boleyn. This act was recorded in the Act of Supremacy in 1534, a document that Thomas More was asked to swear an oath to. The thing was, More couldn't do that in good faith. Not only would it mean denying the Pope's authority, it would deny everything he believed in. So instead of taking the oath or speaking out against it, More did neither. He stayed silent. Henry, though, saw this silence as an act of defiance and as a threat to the stability of his new church. In fact, he actually went to More's house to confront him about it. To Henry, More's silence was tantamount to saying the new law was invalid. For More, he felt he was staying loyal to the king and to his conscience. In any case, Henry saw red, and he ordered More's arrest. At this point, More was treated like a common criminal. They came for him in the middle of the night. He was dragged through the streets of London and thrown into the Tower of London, where he spent almost a year in terrible conditions. He wasn't allowed to see his family, and all of his books were taken away, meaning he couldn't even read during his captivity. Even his daughter, Margaret Roper, who lived in the shadow of the tower, wasn't allowed to visit. She stood in the street below his window every day, calling out, "Father, oh, Father," and he would respond, "Be patient, child, and you shall see me soon." But he never emerged from the tower. Instead, after 9 months in the tower, he was taken out to face trial in Westminster Hall on charges of treason. At this point, his family begged him to take the oath to save his life. But More was a man of great integrity, and he refused. Instead, he decided to mount a defense. His whole strategy was to avoid admitting guilt, but to condemn the king's actions. But really, the outcome of the trial was never in doubt. The jury was packed with pro-Henry men, and there were witnesses ready to testify that More had condemned the king's actions. In fact, the main witness against him was the Solicitor General, Richard Rich, who would later admit that he lied under oath. But that's another story. The jury found More guilty, and he was sentenced to death by beheading. That was actually seen as something of a mercy at the time. The king had considered having him drawn and quartered, a fate worse than death for anyone. Being drawn and quartered meant being tied up and pulled by horses through the streets until your limbs were torn from their sockets. So at least More was going to die quickly. In fact, his execution was quite quick and clean compared to some others, like Mary, Queen of Scots, who had to watch her children get hacked to pieces before she met her own executioner. But nevertheless, More's execution was horrible. He was led through the streets to Tower Hill to the sound of drummers playing and trumpets blaring. A huge crowd had gathered to see him die. There were 50 nobles watching from a nearby building and thousands more on the ground surrounding the scaffold. More behaved with great dignity throughout. He stopped to talk to people he knew, and when he reached the scaffold, he joked with the officer who was helping him climb it. "Pray, see me safe up, and for my coming down, I can shift for myself." Then once he was strapped onto the block, he turned to the executioner and asked him to pull his beard forward so that it wouldn't interfere with the execution. Then he told the executioner, "This at least has not committed treason." Then he closed his eyes and waited for the blow. The executioner, seeing that More had placed his neck willingly on the block, struck once and cleanly, severing More's head from his body. That much is true. But there are differing accounts of what happened next. One version says that his body stayed kneeling on the block, a much more dignified way to go than kneeling on the floor like Mary, Queen of Scots. Others say that More fell onto the ground, his headless body still clutching the block. Either way, the execution was over in seconds. Afterwards, his head was placed on a pike on London Bridge as a warning to other potential traitors. But it was saved from the elements by More's daughter, Margaret Roper. She snuck out of her home in the dead of night, crossed the bridge, and hid her father's head in the folds of her skirts. And that is the dark tale of one of the most horrible executions in English history. Thomas More died a Catholic martyr, but he also became a symbol of conscience, of integrity, and of standing up for what you believe in, even when it seems futile. And if you enjoyed this video, then check out our other series on the most horrible executions in history, where we examine the brutal demise of Mary, Queen of Scots, the truly horrible death penalty in ancient Rome, and the bloody tale of Jack the Ripper's victims. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of the past.